Hello and welcome into the Faculty Pride Podcast. My name is Scott Burns. I'm an economics professor here at Southeastern University, and I'm sitting next to one of the newest additions to Southeastern's faculty, economics professor Li Peng. And real quickly, I want to kind of give you a chance, since you're brand new to the university, to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about where you're from, where you studied. So I'll let you take that away.
All right, how are you all? My name is Li Peng. Like Scott said, I'm the new addition to the Department of Management and Business Administration. I'm also a econ professor. So I was born and raised in China and came to the U.S. for my education, and I got my PhD in economics from George Mason.
And it just so happens, by the way, I got my PhD from George Mason University too. So Lee and I met, what was this be, about 7 or 8 years ago, I guess, originally, back in graduate school. Because it just so happened, whenever I was finishing my PhD, Lee was starting his. And so when I moved out of my apartment, Lee and his wife moved in to the room that I once was in.
Yeah,
so.
We took over, and it was a nice bedroom.
That's right. Well, I want to dive into a couple topics here in this podcast. One of them, and this one I actually want to start with, especially given your background coming from China and being an expert on the Chinese economy. I want to start by talking about what's going on right now in China, in its economy, especially with the aftermath of the pandemic, and very much the pandemic still going on in China. And we still see shutdowns in different parts of the economy, but also talk a little bit about some current events going on with Chinese politics. So let's start with the shutdown, the pandemic, and some of the kind of things that are going on right now that relate to the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in China right now in terms of pandemics and shutdowns?
Definitely. This actually happened to my wife's friend. This just happened in the city of Chongqing. So my wife's friend, she lives in a district, and they got about 1.5 million of population.
Oh man!
One day. Yeah, go ahead.
That one district has a bigger population.
Yeah, exactly.
So
it's kind of funny.
Incredible. Those are such big numbers. I spent a summer in China, and it blows my mind. A small town in China is probably about 1 million people. It's bigger than any city that we have here in Louisiana. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, exactly. No, just on top of that, every time when I talk to my friend about, I told them, okay, I'm from a small town in China, and they said, okay, we're from a small town, and I'm just like, oh yeah, that's awesome. And my town got 5 million people.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, we only got like 10,000 maybe. But anyway, so go back to the COVID policy. So my wife's friend, she lives in this district with a 1.5 million population. I think just 3 days ago, they spotted one positive case, and the district is on lockdown.
Right.
And think about that. And this just some kind of part of the overall the zero COVID case policy in China. So at the beginning of this year, prior to this year, the policy looks fine. Right? The policy looked fine. And of course, they got the pandemic contained in China. But now this year, because at the beginning of this year, we know the COVID has evolved into the Omicron variant, and is very contagious. Mm-hmm. And the zero case policy cannot combat this kind of situation. And think about this: at the very beginning of this year, Shanghai, the financial center of China, was on lockdown, right, for a couple months. Mm-hmm. And it just crippled the whole economy. So the thing is, this is kind of related to the next topic I want to talk about, the sluggish economic growth in the recent year. Well, it's definitely the economic growth in China has been a miracle, but mostly it was state-led, with some market economy elements in the whole process. But in the recent year, especially since the beginning of pandemic, the economic growth is just bad. It's been sluggish. The President Xi, he said he tried to have the economy grow at 6% by the end of the second quarter. Mm-hmm. It never happened, because think about this, right? Right after the Shanghai COVID lockdown, everything looks fine, and the local government, they encourage people, okay, we need to get back on track. Okay, open your shop, open your restaurant, and things like that. But let's think about this case scenario, right? I'm a restaurant owner,
Mm-hmm.
and my business got shut down during the pandemic. And the thing is, we have this zero case policy in place. That means, right, if in the future we just spot another wave of cases coming our way, I have to shut down my business again.
Yeah.
And the thing is, between like the two shutdowns, I've already purchased. I've already paid for my business, right? I gotta purchase the food, right, to serve the customer. But right before I could serve my customer, you told me to shut down again.
Right.
So what would be an incentive to be to be entrepreneurial in the first place, right? If I want to conduct my own business, so that is that. And the next, so there are three major events are going on in China, right? So first, of course, the zero COVID policy, and second is the slower economic growth, and the third one is we're in the middle of election year. It's kind of funny to call it an election year because we don't have election per se, right?
Right. When you mentioned that, I was kind of surprised because when I think of China, I think it's a one-party regime, just the Communist Party. So the idea of them having elections, I knew that they had them at the state and local level from traveling there, but explain how that works in China because it's a little bit different than what we're used to here in the United States.
Yes, they call that election just okay. The government, the authority, they have already pick out like the candidate they want. They just do the election for the sake of formality. Just say, okay, for example, President Xi, when he was re-elected again in 2017, he just asked everybody in the meeting who opposed.
Right.
Nobody said anything. Who will vote for me? And then, of course, everybody raised their hand.
That's right.
That's just for the formality of that. But the funny thing is, President Xi, he actually revised the Chinese constitution in 2017. And of course, that means he set himself for the position of president for the rest of his life.
Right.
Yeah.
So in other words, they didn't necessarily have to have this election, right? Because after 2017, he basically opened the door for him staying in power in perpetuity. So what caused this, I don't know if it's a special election, but what caused it to be called in the first place?
Well, like I said, so it is still for the formality of this. They need to look good, right?
Okay.
To say, okay, we're still elected by the people, but not really. They were determined by the Politburo, by the party seniors. Right? They retired, but they still have a vote, right? Who's gonna be our next president? But the funny thing is, we all assume he's gonna just become the president, right, for the rest of his life, and he's got no problem to win this election. Quotation mark, right? He's gonna win this election this year, but he botched it actually.
Okay. Well, how did he botch it?
Well, first he zeroed a COVID case policy, right? Prior to 2022, he worked at a very high cost. He actually worked, right? He got the pandemic contained. But the thing is, after the Omicron variant become prevalent, there's no way to control that.
Right.
And let's say he has to lock down Shanghai, the financial center of China. He had to lock down Xi'an, another biggest city, one of the biggest city in China. He just work against for for him this year. So first is COVID, and second, of course, like I mentioned, it's we never achieved the targeted growth rate this year. And lastly, it happened recently. We all know House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan.
Right.
That made Xi look very bad.
And just to kind of make sure that people understand the background here, Taiwan is an independent country, but the Chinese government does not recognize it as such. Can you maybe give us a brief history of that conflict over the past, 70, 75 years between China and Taiwan?
Yes. So the thing is, I need to brush up my history a little bit, but so what happened in the past during the World War II? Japan, they invaded Taiwan. I think that's what happened. Of course, after the Second World War II, after the surrender of the Japan, everything got returned to China, and of course, right after that, the Communist Party of China and the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party of China, where they try to fight each other.
Right. There was a civil war basically between Mao Zedong and the communists, and then
Chiang Kai-shek with the
nationalist or the
Yeah, Kuomintang or nationalist. It's the same thing.
And Mao and the communists wound up winning that civil war in I think the late 1940s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
after World War II.
Yes, the late 1940s, and of course the Kuomintang they retreated to Taiwan, and here we go. Taiwan they recognize themselves as a country, right? And China, the mainland China, still think Taiwan is part of the mainland China.
Right.
Yeah.
So China does not recognize it as an independent country, and the controversy with Nancy Pelosi was that she visited Taiwan, which for the Chinese government's a big no-no because in visiting Taiwan, she's visiting the political leadership, and she's in effect recognizing, hey, we're treating this as a sovereign country and as an ally of ours, and that you say created some dissatisfaction in China.
That's an understatement.
Yeah.
Of course, we have these hawkish people like they want blood. Right? They like the Chinese media just say, okay, is the speaker Pelosi, she will be on plane to Taiwan. We need to shut her down, and that never that of course that never happened. Right?
Thankfully, it didn't.
Oh yeah, God, thank God, yeah. And now it makes she looks even worse. Right? So there will be uncertainty regarding whether he will be reelected. My thought would be okay, he will still be the president, but his authority will be greatly diminished.
Right. So 5 years ago, it would have seemed inconceivable that President Xi would ever not be in power in China.
Yep.
But what you're saying is that because of really three factors. One, COVID, but in particular, the kind of draconian, long-lasting zero-COVID policy where they've had shutdowns in effect as recently as the past couple of months in a lot of major cities. That has hurt his popularity, I'm assuming, with a lot of not just ordinary citizens, but I don't know if we clarified this earlier. When we talk about this election, they're not having a billion Chinese citizens vote in this election.
Oh,
correct?
definitely
This is
not.
only the political leadership, the party.
Exactly.
So,
the Politburo.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just, basically existing government officials, many of them are dissatisfied with them because of the zero COVID policy that's caused the second factor, which was an economic slowdown.
Yes.
They've had a stagnant economic growth.
Yes.
China, for most of the past 25, 30 years have been growing at these incredibly rapid rates of 8, 9, 10% a year, which is just incredible growth. It's how it went from being one of the poorest nations on the planet in the 1970s to being a borderline first world country in such a quick period of time. But as you note, they've had a slowdown in economic growth recently. And a little anecdote from when I spent a summer in China back in college, I talked very openly to a lot of Chinese students about what they thought of the government.
Yep.
And obviously they had to be careful. They didn't want to be seen or heard saying anything too critical of the regime. But many of them, in moments of honesty and candor, they'd be very honest and say, yeah, we hate the government. They're very corrupt. We hate this one-party system. We wish we could be more like you in the United States and have free and fair elections and have free press, free speech rights. But we don't have that. And a lot of people, though, said, we're willing to put up with our limited freedoms if the government continues to help deliver the growth that we've experienced over the past 20 years. If the economy keeps growing at 10% a year, then we'll put up with the fact that we don't have a very good political system and that's very corrupt. We'll make that trade-off. But what's very clear right now is that now that economic growth is slowing down, a lot of the same people that were willing to kind of, pinch their nose and put up with the regime are no longer willing to do that. If the regime's not delivering strong growth, then all of a sudden that's when you might see kind of a bottom. I'm not saying that we're going to see another Tiananmen Square necessarily, but you might see more pushback and calls for reform, and that might be what Xi experiences right now in his leadership role.
Definitely, and the human rights in China, they're very very bad shape. So. Actually, I'm not sure if you have heard about the Uyghur persecution in the western part of China. Yeah, my co-author and I, we actually wrote a paper on that. So we don't comment on we don't add any subjective value of our own, right? We know it's bad, but in that paper we just say
to kind of lay the and is it pronounced Uyghur?
Uyghur. I'm not sure if
it's a Muslim population, right?
Yes, Muslim population.
It's a minority population in Western China.
Yes.
A Muslim population that we've seen a lot of news stories over the past couple of years where they've, in effect, the Chinese government's moved them into concentration camps, and there's been all sorts of, at least alleged and pretty obvious, human rights abuses that have definitely not helped the perception of China globally. And it's definitely cause some tension within the country.
Definitely not. And we actually wrote a paper on that because they actually put a specific regional leader to implement those policy in the Uyghur region. So we said, okay, so they want to achieve both high economic growth rate and the high so-called social compliance rate. So that means, okay, we want everybody listen to our instruction. If we think you're some kind of terrorist who would endanger our society, we'll throw you into the concentration camp. Yeah. So we studied the effect of the policy, and we found, well, they did not achieve higher economic growth.
Right.
And the arrest rate we use as a measure of some kind of social compliance measurement just skyrocketed.
Yeah, so you got more people being arrested, but it's not delivering any of the benefits, but it has all sorts of costs, basically. From
Exactly.
What they promised.
The bottom line is you cannot just keep arresting people and while hoping to get higher economic growth.
Right.
Yes.
Well, it's okay now. I think we can pivot to the second topic I want to talk about, unless you had anything to add on the Chinese
definitely.
economy.
Yeah.
So the second topic I want to talk about today is a little bit more in my wheelhouse, which has to do with inflation here in the United States. We've all seen that prices have been going up dramatically, and when we talk about inflation, it's worth noting inflation doesn't just mean the price of one or two things going up. It doesn't just mean the price of gasoline's going up. That's inflation. Inflation happens whenever the price of just about everything's going up all at once, and that's what we've experienced in the U.S. We've seen inflation rates rise from what they usually are, just like maybe 1 or 2%, to 9 or 10%. So our cost of living's gone up dramatically, and a lot of people are wondering why that's the case.
It's my turn to ask Scott a couple questions. So now, here's the thing, right? What do you think are the factors that contribute to the current inflation we're experiencing?
Well, I actually just went over this with my class today, and I broke it down this way. There's about 5 or 6 very popular beliefs about what's caused inflation. That if you read newspapers or you listen to a lot of other podcasts, you'll hear people bring these up all the time. And I think 3 or 4 of them are just bad explanations. They might explain a little bit of why prices have gone up, but they don't explain why prices have gone up so rapidly. And there's a couple that I think are actually the best explanations. So let me start with what I think are the bad explanations. And these are the ones that you're most likely to hear about. If you keep up with politics and you watch cable news or you read the newspaper even, the first is what is sometimes called, that President Biden has labeled at least, the Putin price hike. That the war that was initiated by Russia against Ukraine, obviously that had a big impact on gas prices. Those are 2 big oil-producing nations, and when they went to war, and especially when we put sanctions on Russia, that did cause gas prices to go up pretty dramatically across the globe.
Yep.
It's understandable why that would cause some inflation, because gas is very important to the U.S. economy. Many of us drive. I know that you and I both do. But the price of gas also factors into the price of everything we buy, because whenever we go to the store to buy groceries, those groceries are usually shipped there in an 18-wheeler or a truck that uses gasoline. And so if their costs go up because gas is more expensive, they're probably going to wind up passing that along to consumers in the form of higher prices. So there is a little bit of truth. I give that one a little bit of that theory, that it's because of the war between Russia and Ukraine, a little bit of credence, because that has caused gas prices to go higher. But if you look at the data, gas prices didn't all of a sudden start to go up whenever the war started back in February of 2022. For more than a year and a half before that, gas prices had been going up pretty dramatically. They were about less than $2 a gallon on average nationally about 2 years ago. And even before Russia invaded Ukraine, they'd already gone up by almost 100%. It was almost $4 a gallon, even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which was a pretty unexpected global event. So when Russia invaded, that did cause the price of gas to go up even further. But we'd already seen a bunch of inflation happening, not just in gas prices, a rise in gas prices before the war, but people listening to this podcast probably realize that inflation's been happening not just over the past 5 or 6 months, but for the past couple of years. We really started to feel this in our pocketbooks, not just in the past few months, but really over the past entire 24 months or so. And that's why that explanation to me, that it's all about the war between Russia and Ukraine, is not a very good one. We started to see the seeds of this inflation well before Russia invaded. I think a lot of times politicians like to look for excuses, because a lot of people will blame whoever's in political power for things like inflation, and that's obviously not good for politicians. So they always want to find a scapegoat. And there's a lot of truth to the fact that what Russia did was very bad, and it did cause gas prices to go up. but it's not the biggest factor because we saw inflation happening even before this.
Yeah, but
So
what about this, right? And then we will also read this from the news that it's just the corporate greed.
yes,
It's like they're become greedy. They're gonna just charge everybody like a higher price.
right.
So what's wrong with that kind of
So that's the second most popular explanation that you often hear. Because for the most part, economists kind of dispelled the idea that it was all about the war with Russia and Ukraine and the Putin price hike. And so the second most common explanation that you hear is, well, okay, it's not that, but it's because of corporate greed. It's because corporations have been jacking up prices to try to make more profits. And there's some prima facie evidence that maybe some people look at things like corporate profits going up and they say, well, maybe this is the case. Corporations recorded very high profits in 2021, 2022. And so that's become a very popular explanation too, especially amongst politicians who are looking for a scapegoat and are more than happy to blame companies for inflation. But again, that doesn't seem like a very good explanation when you actually dive into the data. If you actually look at the data, corporate profits are up, but not that much. Certainly not enough to explain a huge uptick in inflation like we've seen over the past couple of years. So that might explain why there would be like a 0.5% increase of inflation, but it doesn't explain why inflation rose by 7 or 8% all of a sudden. And more importantly, the reason that I think the corporate greed explanation is not a good one is blaming corporations and greed in particular on prices going up is like blaming plane crashes on gravity. If I were to tell you, hey, there was a plane crash yesterday, you know what caused it? Gravity. What would you say? Is that a good explanation?
That's true.
It's not a very good explanation, right? Because gravity's a constant. So that doesn't cause planes to crash. We need to look for a better explanation for why that plane crashed. We want to explain exactly what happened there. The same thing's true of greed. Greed didn't just all of a sudden come into existence 12 or 24 months ago. Corporations didn't just decide a few months ago that they wanted to get greedy all of a sudden. They always want to make money. They're always trying to maximize profits. So I don't think that's a very good explanation for where this inflation's coming from because corporations have always tried to make money. The question is, what is truly causing this? And I just don't think the corporate greed explanation is a big factor. And most economists agree. You see that about 98% of economists, when they're polled on this question, say that's a very bad explanation. This is not about corporate greed. Corporations are always trying to make money, but that doesn't mean that we always see 10, 12, 14% inflation. There must be some other factors at play.
Yep. So you just mentioned two of the so-called
bad explanations.
Very bad explanation. So
Yeah.
what would be the so-called the appropriate explanation for the inflation?
So
we
to me,
observe?
two better explanations than that have to do with, first of all, what's happening in terms of the money supply. As an economist, especially a monetary economist, whenever we talk about inflation, the first place I look whenever prices are going up is at the money supply. Just like if you were to drive by a lake and you noticed that all the fishes were dead in that lake, they were just floating at the top of the lake, they're dead, you probably wouldn't blame all the fishes being dead on, man, I guess some of the barracudas or sharks in the area got really greedy all of a sudden and decided to go on a killing spree. You'd probably look at what? If you're trying to figure out why all the fish in a lake died. You'd probably look at the water supply, right?
Yes.
Because that's what all the fish share in common. Well, in an economy like ours, what do all people and businesses share in common? Money. Money is 1/2 of every transaction. Every time you buy something, you're using money, right? And so whenever I see something like inflation going on, I look at the money supply because that would explain why we'd see a rise in prices across the entire economy and things that affect everybody in the economy, not just a few individuals. And what we saw is that the Fed, back during the pandemic, responded very aggressively by more than doubling the money supply from about $3 trillion to a little bit over $6 trillion during the pandemic. Now, I'm not saying that was necessarily a bad idea because during the pandemic, everyone was freaking out. The Fed was concerned about bank runs and panics and people trying to take their money out of the bank. And so to stabilize the economy, it created a lot of money to basically tell people, hey, don't worry. We've made sure that your banks have enough reserves so that you don't have to run to the bank and take your money out. Everything's going to be okay. That could be defended to some degree. Reasonable economists can disagree about how much the Fed increased the money supply. It was probably a little bit more than they needed to, but that's at least debatable. What to me is not too debatable and what many economists agree on is that the Fed has not reduced the money supply even as we've come out of the pandemic. So the economy's gotten a lot healthier over the past 2 years. And you'd expect that in response to that, the Fed would start to reduce the money supply again back to the pre-pandemic levels, kind of get us back to normal now that things are getting back to normal. It hasn't really done that. It's been very slow to reduce the money supply and raise interest rates. And even though it has started to do that, a lot of economists said, hey, you're too late. This should have been started about a year ago.
Yep.
And so there's a lot of money in the economy that the Fed did not effectively kind of hoover up or suck up in time. And so to me, that's a big factor explaining inflation. So that's one of the good explanations to me, is that there's probably too much money in the economy right now, and that has to do with the Federal Reserve and central bank policy, since they control the money supply. And then the second explanation that I think most economists agree is pretty powerful has to do with government spending. It's a very similar story to what we just talked about with the Fed and the money supply. During the pandemic, the government spent a lot of money. It more than doubled its budget, and a lot of that could be definitely seen as reasonable. We understand why whenever there was a massive shutdown, you didn't want people to lose their jobs and have no source of income for an extended period of time, so the government did things like it expanded unemployment benefits to make sure that people had a safety net, that they weren't without income during these massive shutdowns. And it did a whole bunch of things to try to stabilize the economy during the shutdowns. But again, we're 2 years removed now from the kind of depths of the pandemic and the lockdown, and government spending is still way above what it usually would be. Before the pandemic, government spent about 20% of all spending in the economy was from the U.S. federal government. During the pandemic, it was more than 35%. So more than $1 out of every $3 that was spent was by the U.S. government. Today, it's still pretty close to 1/3 of all spending is done by the U.S. government. That's way higher than it normally is. And we've seen a lot of bills pass in the past few years, and even going back to the pandemic. So this is not blaming anything on the current administration necessarily, because we saw both the current administration and the previous one, they spent money like crazy. But what a lot of economists agree is that the government was spending too much money. And because the government's the biggest player in the economy, the federal government's got about a $6 trillion budget. It's been spending about $5 or $6 trillion a year. That makes it by far the biggest player in our economy. If it's spending too much, then much like the Fed printing too much money and pumping it into the economy, that's going to cause prices to rise. There's too much spending chasing too few goods. So to me, those are the two best explanations of inflation. Too much money, and then probably more spending, more government spending than we need right now.
That is awesome. Thank you, Scott.
All right. Well, that wraps up our conversation. I'm pretty sure. Did you have anything else you wanted to add before we close out the podcast for the day? No?
Yep.
All right. Well, if you're good, then I think we'll go ahead and call it quits here. Thank you very much for listening to the Faculty Pride Podcast. Again, my name is Scott Burns. I'm an economics professor here at Southeastern, and I've been joined by my colleague.
I'm Li Pan. I'm also an assistant professor of economics in the Department of Management and the Business Administration at Southeastern.
All right. Well, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.